Well, now I'll open it to the House, and please state your name for the record, and then ask a question or make a comment as brief as possible so that we can get as many questions as possible. Yes?
I have like two questions. My first question is, Sri Lanka is moving more towards the Chinese sphere of influence, while Singapore is more or less in the American sphere of influence. So how would that impact the future relations, and where do you see that going? And my second question is that, do you think it's a practical and wise step to actually go into that direction for Sri Lanka?
Is this directed at me or at Professor
Maybe
Pires?
I start with Professor Pires. I think he should.
I think it's directed at me. I'll deal with it. You know, it's a sexy line which plays for good newspaper copy to divide the world into spheres of influence, and then say this is Chinese sphere of influence, this is American sphere of influence, and there is going to be, you know, two blocks, and are you with me or are you against me? I disagree with that characterization, at least as far as Singapore is concerned. Are we in the American sphere of influence? No. Are we an American ally? No. We are a tiny island, 720 square kilometers, the tip of the Asian mainland, as it were. I mean, Indonesia is below us, but we're pretty much the southern tip of Asian mainland. With when we started out, under 2 million population, now 3.2 million citizens, and another 2 odd million people who are in Singapore, various lengths of stay. If you want to run such a country, and it's a country, you need to protect your sovereignty, and protecting your sovereignty means having a credible defense force. And having a credible defense force is the start, but it cannot be the start in the end. You also need regional stability. And there are many facets to regional stability. One is you must make sure your relationship with your neighbors is good. Second, internationally, you need to be quite active, and we are reasonably active with very multifaceted relationships. But beyond all of that, you also need to actively work for stability. Now, prior to the rise of China, if you wanted stability, who was in a position to enforce that stability, who ensured that stability? It's really the US. The US presence in the Pacific and in the region made sure that the region was stable. And that stability allowed many Southeast Asian countries, not just Singapore, the other Southeast Asian countries as well, to progress at a rapid clip. And therefore, Singapore has been a public proponent of US presence for the purposes of stability. At the same time, most people know, who know Singapore's foreign policy and history, that we are very close to China. We have a strong economic relationship. We have a strong strategic relationship. Mr. Lee was highly regarded in China. And in many ways, Singapore started a number of projects in China as a joint venture because China wanted to see how it was possible to have internal stability in a country and yet progress economically in a free environment. And that is a model that they studied and continue to study very actively. As a small country, we are in no position to go and choose one or another major power. Our approach is to have a good relationship with everyone. So we are not in the American sphere of influence. I would venture to suggest that there is no American sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. If you put that question to the Malaysians or Indonesians, I think you will get a similar answer. Sri Lanka, I don't want to be commenting on the foreign policy, but whether Sri Lanka is in anyone's sphere is something that Professor Pires might well disagree with, but it has not stopped, as you can see, very close relationship between us and Sri Lanka. Whether Sri Lanka is in the American sphere of influence or Chinese sphere of influence or both, I think Sri Lanka and Singapore have a great future together.
Well, we are not in anybody's sphere of influence. And Sri Lanka's relationship with China is greatly misunderstood and sometimes deliberately distorted. Look at the reality of the situation. This was not a relationship which began yesterday or the day before. Just look at Colombo's skyline. You know, the Bandaranaike International Hall, where we held the Commonwealth Summit in November. That was a gift by the government of China to the late Prime Minister Sirimavo Bandaranaike in the early 70s. In memory of Prime Minister S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike, who was assassinated in 1958. Then in the 80s, they made a donation of the building which today accommodates the superior courts of the island, the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal. It's a magnificent building which reflects many features of Kandyan architecture. Then much more recently, a few months ago, they gifted to us a state-of-the-art facility, the Center for the Performing Arts. You know, we have a great deal of cultural talent in this country, but the full flowering of that talent was impeded by the lack of such a facility, which the Chinese provided for us. So it's not a new relationship. It's a relationship which is established and which has stood the test of time. Of course, in the recent past, we have upgraded that relationship, and in discussions that took place between President Mahinda Rajapaksa of Sri Lanka and President Xi Jinping of China, we decided to elevate the relationship to the threshold of a strategic cooperation partnership. And we are now working actively towards a free trade agreement with China. The feasibility studies have already been completed. Now, in fairness to China, there has never been any attempt on their part to control our ports and harbors or anything of that sort. I want to say publicly that that is not the case at all. Of course, China has helped us in a very big way to build our infrastructure, our highways, our railroad systems, to revamp our power and energy sector. They have helped us enormously, and we have made use of Chinese resources. But with that has not come any sort of attempt to control, to have ownership or dominion. That is not the case. So I entirely agree with my distinguished colleague that this analysis in terms of who falls within whose sphere of influence, that is totally misconceived. Robert Kaplan's book, American Power in the Indian Ocean, also proceeds on those lines. I mean, there are factual inaccuracies also in the chapter on Sri Lanka. Certainly, there are things which are not factually correct. So I think that is far too simplistic a view of the world. Black and white, two camps. In fact, there are no two camps today.
Multipolar.
No, multipolar. So that analysis is a little bit anachronistic. It may have been true of a different world. It does not reflect the realities of the contemporary situation. And to approach issues in the modern world from that standpoint, two blocks and who belongs where, I think that is a singularly unhelpful and unrealistic way of reflecting on contemporary issues.
Really, you're talking about concentric circles, different issues, economic issues, political issues, strategic issues. You know, nowadays you have environmental issues. On different issues, there will be different groupings, as you have seen.
A few days ago, the government banned several diaspora organizations, Tamil diaspora organizations, because they were engaging in anti-Sri Lanka activities. However, these organizations represent a significant proportion of the diaspora, which is very powerful. They have links with the people living in Sri Lanka also. I'm wondering what Professor Peiris thinks the next step forward would be. What is the future trajectory that he sees? what is the realistic trajectory, what is the best case trajectory, because obviously it would be better if we can all work together. And I would also like to know from the Foreign Minister of Singapore what his own thoughts are and what Singapore can do. You have taken a lot of interest in producing this encyclopedia. We appreciate that. What role can Singapore play to bring about reconciliation and healing in Sri Lanka?
Professor Perry, maybe?
Well, it is certainly a wish to work cordially with the diaspora. We don't wish to marginalize them or to have a confrontational relationship with them. I think the first thing to note is the diaspora is no longer a monolith. It consists of very different points of view. There are different nuances and gradations. And as I said, there is a segment of it that wishes to work purposefully in this country, not for political reasons, but these are business people who also have a concern about the well-being of the people of the North. At the same time, we must not forget that at the other end of the spectrum, there is a section of the diaspora that has not given up the dream of Elam. Let's face that. And they are thinking of ways and means of reviving that. That is part of the regrettable reality of the situation. Now, the initiative that you referred to was really under the aegis of a UN Security Council resolution, and it had to do with terrorist financing. This is something that we have to be eternally vigilant about. This is of concern not only to Sri Lanka, but to a wider swath of the international community. And there are governments talking to us all the time about problems relating to money laundering, transfers of large financial resources outside the established banking channels. And some recent events in this country have highlighted the need for greater circumspection in this area. So there is a certain regime which has been established, as I said, under UN auspices. And I want to say this very clearly, that a country which has paid a very heavy price because of terrorist activity over 3 long decades certainly cannot be complacent. There certainly is no prospect of a terrorist war. That's not going to happen. We are sure of that. But government would be remiss if we did not take note of some of these developments which are now taking place. And this was a preemptive measure to make absolutely certain that problems do not arise with regard to terrorist financing, and things are nipped in the bud. Things are nipped in the bud before they go any further. So that is based on a security assessment in our country, and that was a necessary response. It is not intended to express some kind of general attitude of hostility to the diaspora. That is definitely not the case. It does not mean, or must not be taken to imply, that we don't want to work with the diaspora, that we look upon the diaspora as a hostile force. Not in the least. We are engaging with the diaspora. They have come here, they have spoken to me, they have spoken to the Secretary of Defense. We are exploring avenues for them to get more involved in the development of our economy, in making major investments in this country. And there is resonance. There is definite resonance on the part of a considerable section of the diaspora. So that is the way we look at this situation.
Want me to?
Yes.
On the second part, what can Singapore do? I think it's a very big question, but let me put it this way. There are many facets to the issue. The long civil war has left many, many facets. But if you take a couple of major facets, one is what happened and the degree to which there needs to be closure in a certain manner that is just and equitable for all, the majority as well as the minority communities. And the second aspect, which is where do you go from here? We have been, as Singapore, very focused on that second question. Where do we go from here? Why do I say that? I visited Jaffna 2 years ago on my introductory visit to Sri Lanka as foreign minister. And really, what did the people say they want? They want education for their children. They want a better life. It's basically every people's dream. Doesn't matter whether they are Sinhala or Tamil or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu. Everybody wants a better life for themselves and their children. So what do we do now to make their lives better? That, to me, is a fundamental question. The primary responsibility for that, of course, is with Sri Lanka itself. But those of us who are friends of Sri Lanka can do something about it. So we are very small in the scheme of things. But that is the message that we have been putting out. On my visit then, after visiting the governor, it's my practice to generally ask to stop at somewhere local to get a feel for the place. Because normally a foreign minister goes into a hotel, all hotel rooms look the same, and then you go to meetings and then you go back. But you don't really get a feel. And I usually ask to stop somewhere. So I did. I think Ambassador Pillai was with me, Ambassador Singh was with me, a few others. The security people all got very worried because this was a roadside cafe. We sat down, we ordered some things. I looked at the lady, we talked with her, and what did she say? She said, look, previously it was very difficult. Today things are much better, and she is supporting her family. She's hoping that her business will grow. She had a little bit of jewelry on her. And basically, these are people on the ground being able to try and make a better life for themselves. And I think really our task is to try and help them. When I visited the new developments, what did the mothers want? They said, look, losses we can commit are not going to be very large. We are not the US or UK or China. But we looked at it and we said, look, what makes a significant difference is education. So if we were to, we don't have the resources to train the students directly, but if we were to bring the latest pedagogical methods on teaching of English and assessment, and if we train the teachers, then there is a multiplier effect. If we started a mobile library, and I think 10,000 or so books have been donated by our library. It goes around 38 schools. That makes an impact. If we started a youth center and we trained the librarians to deal with the children and help them with English, that makes a difference. Small, but I think highly symbolic, highly valuable, and with tremendous multiplier effect. And I'm talking to Ambassador Pillai to see whether we can interest the private sector to come in and help on IT training. There are huge companies in India, companies outside, for whom this would be part of their corporate social responsibility. And if you can train those children, you make a far bigger impact on the lives of people compared with any number of international statements talking about the past. So I think I do accept that, as I said, reconciliation has got a number of different facets, including a closure of what has happened in a way that is just and equitable for all. But this has been our focus, because we think we can add value here. And we have talked with Professor Perez, and I have said, look, some mechanism has to be found and really this is difficult to impose from outside. Some mechanism has to be found that is acceptable to all the communities to find an acceptable closure of the past.
Well, if I might add a comment on that, Yes, the minister said Singapore is not very large, so they cannot undertake all of it themselves. But Singapore has been very focused and has contributed value where it is most needed. Now, a good example is the vocational training initiative in the north. Now, there's no doubt that Singapore has unrivaled expertise with regard to the development of curricula. They're doing this very successfully elsewhere in New Delhi, for example. And I think you're doing it also in Vietnam.
Yes, Vietnam, Myanmar, Delhi.
Yeah. Now, the course content is universally acclaimed. It is really strong. And we have the advantage of having an input from Singapore with regard to that, the course content. And also training the trainers.
Training the trainers.
Yeah, because it would be unrealistic to expect Singapore to send trainers in such large numbers as to be sufficient to train all the students here. That's not a realistic proposition, but they will train the trainers, they supply the content. And the combination of those two elements will make for a really valuable service, which the people of the north will benefit from. And as I said earlier, that is definitely in line with the priorities that they themselves have identified. There's no good doing for people what you think they need. You must ask them what they need, and then you have to respond to the needs which they identify, and we're doing that with the support of Singapore, and we appreciate that very much.
We also work with the government of Sri Lanka in terms of, the other area Professor Paris mentioned was public service. We have some degree of experience, I won't say expertise, but experience in handling urban management solutions, running city. And so Sri Lanka is actually, we run a program called the Singapore Cooperation Program, where officials from around the world come to Singapore. They spend between a week to 4 weeks and understand how we do things. And in that way, and they are usually public servants, that way we hope to impart our knowledge to them, and then they go back and see what is applicable. Some would be relevant, some would not be relevant. We have had over 80,000 public servants from around the world coming to Singapore to take part in these programs over the years, and we are ramping it up. Sri Lanka has been the largest participant in the program from South Asia. Over 2,000 officials from Colombo and around the country have come to Singapore to take part in these. So it's a multifaceted relationship.
Of the Sri Lankan diaspora, but I remember that excellent book brought out by S. Durrajasingham, 100 years of 100 years of Ceylonese in Malaysia, published in the early 1960s, with pictures of hundreds of members of the Ceylonese diaspora. The specific question I want to address to you in the context of what has happened in this country. I was a lecturer in Jaffna for many years. And there was a time, as a student and later as a lecturer, we had hundreds of students come from Singapore and Malaysia to study in Jaffna. When we had the University of London degrees, one day the government of Sri Lanka, in its wisdom, decided to ban the holding of London degrees, and that experiment ended. That was one of my happiest experience, teaching students who came from Singapore and Malaysia, and together with our students. My question to you is, how did you manage to hold on to English in Singapore? I know it's very multi-ethnic, but wasn't there any resistance from the Chinese communities, ancient civilization? And one of the great achievements of Singapore today is the great advances you have made in the professions, in the universities, and the school system. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's a very, very deep, very, if I may say, pointed question. I think you know the answer. You see, for Singapore, when we became independence, or rather when independence was thrust upon us in 1965, not many people expected us to survive. Because, for example, we were relying on Malaysia for water on a daily basis. Today we are self-sufficient, but under treaty we are entitled to draw, and we still draw water. But Mr. Lee had by then, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in the early 60s, could see the experience of many countries in Africa, Asia. The population of Singapore, three major races, 75% Chinese, varies between, well, at one stage 76, 77, now maybe 74.5, but let's say 75%. Malays about 15%, Tamils, well, Indian population about 8%, 8%, and the rest are Eurasians and others. The natural approach would have been, and there was pressure to make Chinese the language, lingua franca, and the business language. I think Mr. Lee describes this in his books. There were two reasons why he decided that English would be the language of business and English will be the language in the schools. And that's because that then allowed a common space for all the different peoples to come together and deal with each other. And no one needed to feel that they were excluded or included. But at the same time, he recognized that in some way, I think you become muted inside you or deculturalized if you don't have access to your own language. And I believe that very strongly because I was fortunate to have grown up in an environment where my mother tongue, as it were, was spoken at home, and I read and understood and actually accessed it at quite a high level beyond what the school provided. And that creates in you a certain stability, a certain access to your own culture, which I think English alone cannot give you. And we therefore emphasized that everyone had to take a second language, and that second language had to be your mother tongue. And that was at great political cost in both ways, because a lot of people did not want to do that second language. Accessing the second language was difficult in a fast-moving environment where English was a business language. The political cost was also paid in the early days in terms of insisting that English should be the language of commerce. He was able to do it because a variety of circumstances. One, I think it does matter that Singapore is small. A smaller place is much easier to govern, much easier to put in policies like this and move ahead. A bigger country, I think it's much more difficult. Geographically, population-wise, the larger the country, the more difficult it is, I think, to structure these things. Second, I think in those days, people understood in Singapore that without the internal resources, without natural resources, and being as vulnerable as we were, we needed to gear up quickly and get in foreign investments. Foreign investors are not going to come in there in order to help you. They are coming in there to make a profit. And you needed English proficiency in order to work with them and work in their factories and work in their businesses. You want to be a financial center, you needed to know English. So the Singaporean is practical, and they understood the economic necessity. And today, with the rise of China and our close relationship with China, a lot of people, even non-Chinese, say, oh, well, we better learn Mandarin as well, as much as we can. Can that be replicated elsewhere? You know, the experience of Singapore is very, I think in many ways, very unique and not easily replicable in other countries. That's the best answer I can give you.
If I may just add one word to what Minister Shanmugam says, because I'm much older than them. There was a time when the lingua franca of the country was more Malay than English. Because if a Chinese laborer wanted to talk to an Indian laborer, he spoke to him in Malay. Yes. Today, it's English. Yes. And the country has benefited from this move because we could justify the usage of English as an international business language. And people felt more empowered by the usage of English. So it was accepted. Even the Malays accept. You know, you talk to a Malay taxi driver, in Malay he replies to you in English. because he thinks you are not a Malay. I talk to you in a common language. And there's no sort of unhappiness about it, a feeling of loss. So it has happened in a very natural way, movement to English, even a broken English, but enough to communicate. So Singapore has been fortunate in that. And I think others can follow, but anyway, that depends. Okay, next question.
Mr. Shanmugam, Mr. Pillai, how have you taught your people to be pragmatic? Because that's what Singapore's known for. And it's been the key of its success in many ways.
How have we taught our people to be pragmatic? I think the human being is basically a pragmatic person. But politics sometimes can play strange games. And for us, I would say the answer is slightly simpler again. If you go back again to 1959 when the PAP government took power, self-government, and 1965 when we became fully independent, the success was not guaranteed. The British were withdrawing, the British were contributing 20% of our GDP, no resources whatsoever to speak of, no internal defense, nothing. It's a swampland. As I said, in those days it was 600 square kilometers. Now with some stealing from the sea, it's 720 square kilometers. We were lucky to have a generation of leaders, and I put it down to luck, because no political system could have guaranteed this. We were lucky to have a leadership that A, was extremely charismatic and could win the trust of the people. But you know, post-World War, you saw lots of countries with extremely charismatic leaders. You had them in various countries. I'll cause offense if I name them, but you had them in Africa and Asia. Very charismatic. They won the fight against the colonialists. They came into power. The people adored them. But even when they were good men, and they were mainly men, they were all men, they were not very good at administering the country. So that's where luck comes in, because our people were, we had about 5-7 ministers who were extremely competent. Now, competence without charisma and the ability to win elections, you're out of it, you know. So they had both. There were people who were charismatic but not competent. There were competent people who were not charismatic. We were lucky in that those two came together. And a third vital ingredient, I keep telling my audiences, which again cannot be legislated for. You can have the most beautiful constitutions and laws, but you can't guarantee this. That group was incorruptible. They were personally of the highest standards of probity. They never touched a cent, and they worked entirely for the country. Now you tell me, how do you guarantee this? So when they did that, every 5 years, people's lives improved. We started out, I can remember, I'm in my 50s, you know, 3 families, 4 families living together in one house, the entire family in one room, another family in another room, 3-4 families, and then sharing one bathroom, slums, what we call kampongs, various different places. 5 years later, a new school comes up, a block of flats comes up where you can rent an apartment, your own apartment. It's progress. 5 years later, you can move into your own apartment, which you can buy at state-subsidized prices. Your children are going to secondary school. Polytechnics are being built. 5 years later, you move from a 3-room small flat to a 4-room flat. 5 years later, you move to a 5-room flat. So people saw tangible progress, material progress along the way, together with the government mantra that continuously emphasized hard work, personal responsibility, no borrowings, no deficit funding, and we needed to be relevant to the world in order to survive. That message was constantly emphasized. The fact that we didn't have natural resources and couldn't survive otherwise, I think helped. So that sort of political structure and system and values the first generation then imbued in others in succeeding generations. But you know, Singaporeans are not somehow or in some way superior in it than anyone else. And I think all cultures, all societies, all people will face the same pressures. And today we are in a slightly better position economically, in terms of our survivability. And the new generation's outlook is different from that of the generation 20, 30 years ago. So I wouldn't say our position is to be taken for granted, nor is it a certain one. Countries go up, countries go down. It all depends on the leadership at that point in time.
My question is primarily directed at Minister Shanmugam. My name is Janine Fernando. And my question is, previously Professor Pires mentioned the success of Singapore in its public service. When you look at Sri Lanka today, one of the primary sort of drawbacks has been its sort of lagging regulatory power. And if you look at the Doing Business Index, though we have overall rank of about 80, when it comes to enforcing contracts, we seem to lag behind, where it takes average of 1,300 days to enforce a contract. So as Minister of Law, I would like to know if you could comment on what made Singapore successful in the field of law and whether there are lessons for Sri Lanka in terms of legal reform.
Really, there are two aspects to your question. One is the legal framework and how the laws operate in practice. And the second is the business environment. If I may talk about the first, I mean, what I say would come as no surprise to Professor Pires. Really, you know, we both, Sri Lanka and Singapore, share the same common law heritage. We got our legal system. I think yours might have some Dutch influence as well.
Not very much, but we do have it.
But common law taken from the United Kingdom when they were the colonial masters. Early on, we said, look, for us to survive, we needed a strong framework of law, rule of law, where whoever you are, whatever you are, whether you're a minister or you're a member of parliament or a man in the street, the same law applies to you. And whether you're a big investor or a small investor, you know that your property is safe. And any acquisition is done under a framework of laws, a legal system that is tough but fair, equally tough on all and equally fair to all. That has helped in making people feel that they are working within a system, both Singaporeans and non-Singaporeans, both locals and foreign investors, that they work in a system which is transparent and predictable. The second part of your question, in terms of business environment, again, it's difficult to say that what works in one country will work in another country. You have a long established history, you have your own way of doing business, you have natural resources, and naturally people might say, why should we allow foreign investment to come in to exploit our natural resources? I mean, that's a question that many people might ask. For us, it was slightly different. We had no natural resources for anyone to exploit. So it's really a question of how can we make sure that the investor comes, and we know that why should the investor come unless he's going to make money, right? There's a famous story of our finance minister saying to investor, of course I want you to make money, because that was at the time, 1960s, when countries thought investors should come but they shouldn't make money. But we took the view that investment means people must make money and we must make it work, and our benefit out of that is the taxes, the employment, and the local know-how increases. It's a longer, harder route, but we had no choice. You have a multiplicity of choices because you have resources, you have a bigger population, you have land, you're agriculturally wealthy, so there are so many things you can do. And what we have not achieved I think would pale compared to your own potential. With 30 million people and the kind of resources you have, with the war over, you have a tremendous bright future. You've got to get the framework right, and it's a work in progress, I would assume.
Well, our approach is certainly we want investors to come in, and we realize, of course, that investors are not going to come in unless conditions are such that they can make money. But it's one of those situations in life where you have to balance different things. You want investment, you want development, you want technology transfer.
Yeah.
But there are also domestic interests which have to be identified and protected. Yeah. And it is a question of finding a healthy equilibrium between these things, while creating the conditions that are conducive to enhanced investment. How do you make certain that that does not result in inequity, in development which is unbalanced, which might trigger social tensions, particularly among the youth? I mean, after all, Sri Lanka is a country which has experienced 2 youth insurrections in the early 70s and the late 80s. So how do you take all those elements into account and construct a policy that is well-rounded? And as somebody said, pragmatic. That is an example of pragmatism.
And as I said earlier, for example, from Singapore, there is a lot of interest. Of course, people will come and assess for themselves. But if you went and asked, there's a lot of interest.
I'm Sanath De Silva from National Defence University of Sri Lanka, Kotalala Defence University. I'm asking my question from Honorable Minister Shanmugam about this concept of...
Professor Perez is going to feel left out.
That's okay. No, they can talk to me anytime.
Professor Perez is also, he can add his comments. This is about this concept that we are having as a national interest at the moment of Sri Lanka to become a hub. So I know that we all know that Singapore is functioning as a hub for a long time in many aspects. How do you think, how do you evaluate Sri Lanka's journey that we have started, and where are we now, and what are the challenges that you see, because we all are living next to a giant country, like you are living next to China and we are living next to Sri Lanka, India. So big markets, and how do you survive, and are we in the right track? What's your comment?
Sri Lanka is a bit bigger than us, but I suppose compared with India, it's a little bit smaller, and compared with China. I think the best lesson in foreign policy that I had was when I was a high school student, when a minister from Africa came, and it was from a small country, I cannot remember which one, and he said, for small countries, it's like living next to big countries. Small countries are like grass, and the big countries are like elephant. When the elephants make love, it's the grass which suffers. And when the elephants fight, it's also the grass which suffers. So we as a small country, remember that. I suppose you are a small country as well, relative to your neighbors. But the other perspective on it is, when you have countries like China and India, one nearer than the other, but both somewhat near, growing well, assuming India's growth recovers to somewhat approximating its natural trajectory, and China's, they say it's a bad year when it's 7.5%. You have tremendous potential, because small countries next to large economies can do very well, because there's so much potential in the economies of the big countries. There are so many things, but within their own, we talked about frameworks just now, the trade-offs that are necessary in countries. The big countries have many more trade-offs. A smaller country like Sri Lanka is less trade-offs. An even smaller country like Singapore is less trade-offs. So you have so much potential to see which part of the growing Indian economy, which part of the growing Chinese economy you can work with or partner with. And likewise, I mentioned ASEAN. You have bright people. What do you not have? You have bright people. You have human resources. You have young population, which is a tremendous bonus in the context of rapidly aging societies in many other places. You have a decent education system which needs to be upgraded a little bit more on the technical side, which the government has identified as a priority, and I assume will focus on. Professor Perez told me that's a priority area. You have a great location. You have internal natural resources. So what do you lack? What can hold you back from benefiting tremendously from the growth of the Asian giants? If we can do it, you can do it so much more. You have growth all around you. It's simply a question of accessing it, getting the framework right. You talked about a hub. You look at your location, I assume you're talking about air, sea hubs. Air hubs, one has got to think about it because nowadays you have planes which can bypass many of the intermediate hubs. And Dubai has taken a substantive lead in these things. Generally within a region, there are only one hub. So Sri Lanka will have to see how it fits in within that framework. Sea hub, it makes a lot of sense because you are on major routes. Also, you are in a tremendous position to service the Indian economy in the logistics sector. So I don't see, well, I see tremendous potential. I don't see why anyone should say the potential is not there. The real question is, how do you achieve it?
Well, the proximity to a large country, we have, of course, the free trade agreement with India.
Yeah.
That has been operative since the year 2000. And it has seen the increase in the volumes of trade between the two countries by about 700%. It has also stimulated investment into Sri Lanka by third countries which want to make use of the FTA as a means of accessing the huge markets of India.
Yeah.
Because if you comply with the rules of origin and value addition at approximately 35%, by which I mean the use of Sri Lankan materials or Sri Lankan services, then the companies coming in here and investing have access into the Indian markets duty-free. So I believe you have a CICA arrangement, right?
We have CICA with India.
CICA with Singapore.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, of course, these things have to be operated in a way that protects local industry. Local industry, our chambers of commerce are constantly talking to us about the measures that are necessary to safeguard domestic interests, but subject to that. Agreements, arrangements of that kind have certainly administered a very powerful stimulus to our economy.
My name is Chaminda Tiarachi. Now, since both of you are, in addition to being foreign ministers, also you are like reputed academics, so I want to ask about higher education sector. Now, we know in Singapore we have NTU and NUS rank consistently high in the global ranking in all kind of engineering, management and all subjects. Compared to Sri Lanka, is a tradition, longer history, but not really perform well in terms of ranking. So, are there any tips you can share with us in terms of making our universities perform better, particularly about maybe deregulation and any other dimension? And also, I'd like to Professor Pierce also remark on that. Thank you.
Well, if I were you, I wouldn't be over concerned with rankings, to be honest. You know, rankings have their own methodology, a number of papers that are published and in the international journals and so on. The real point is the university adding value to the students who go in? Do they come out employable? Do they come out capable of the different things that people want to do? At the highest levels of academia, in students who want to pursue PhD, and then more modestly, people who want to go into business, private sector, and people who want to go into public service. And the question is, do you have the ability, do your people have the ability Before NUS and NTU, there was a University of Ceylon. There's always been a University of Ceylon, which produced supremely able people. Some of our best doctors in Singapore, some of our best lawyers were educated in University of Ceylon. So I don't think there is any question on competence or ability. You had internal problems which lasted for 30 years. That impacted substantially on your ability to invest in human resources, in education. And I think once that's put aside, the focus on getting your universities to train people to the highest standards should not be a challenge for Sri Lanka. I mean, that's my personal view.
Well, in Sri Lanka, as far as tertiary education is concerned, I think we have two challenges. One is to democratize the system and make it available to the vast mass of people in our country. That's very important. Now, I read for my first degree in the University of Ceylon, and in my first year in the Faculty of Law, we had a compulsory paper in Latin. The Roman Law 4, as it was called, was Latin. Now, there couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 schools in the country that taught Latin. So that is a very elitist system. I mean, it produced extraordinarily able people. There's no question about that. But the pool that you were able to draw from was unacceptably and grotesquely narrow. So, now, when I was Vice Chancellor, I presided over some of those dramatic changes that took place in my time, in my batch. There were 17 students. But when I became Dean of the Faculty of Law and subsequently Vice Chancellor, the number increased from 17 to something like 200. So there were real challenges about the quality of tutorials, things of that kind. You know. But you have to meet those challenges. You can't, in a spirit of complacency, go on with a system, however excellent it may be, which caters for a minuscule segment of your society. It's simply not acceptable. So that's a challenge that we had to grapple with. The second challenge, again on the subject of pragmatism, to make university courses more relevant. You know, they must lead to employment opportunities. And very recently, the government of Sri Lanka has introduced a new stream, the technology stream. You know, that is to find out what are the opportunities that are available in the marketplace, what are the skills that are being sought there, and then structure your courses in such a way as to refine and to develop the skills for which there is a pragmatic demand. So that's the second challenge, and we are grappling with both those.
Maurice Jaga, to Minister Shanmugam, you did point out that politics plays strange games. I suppose it can be argued that Sri Lanka has not fulfilled its potential post-independent Sri Lanka has not fulfilled its potential because of politics and the games that politics has played. Being the legal luminary that you are, what would be your thoughts on the outcomes that the country must work towards in coming up with a constitutional framework that will provide the basis for a prosperous and peaceful Sri Lanka?
You're asking that question in the presence of Professor Perez, who is the leading expert in the field of constitutions in general and the Constitution of Sri Lanka in particular. So I'm going to leave the question to him.
Well, constitutions have to reflect the aspirations of people. And they have constantly to respond to what people consider to be important at a particular time. I don't agree that the full exploitation of Sri Lanka's inherent potential has been inhibited by politics. That is not the case. I mean, we are proud of our democratic tradition. We had the universal franchise in 1931, before we became independent.
Universal franchise.
Yeah, universal franchise in 1931, and our women began voting, I think something like 6 months after women in the UK had the right to vote. So that's a tradition that we need to be proud of. And we have at regular intervals held elections throughout that period, and today in Sri Lanka every 6 months people have the opportunity of making their views known. So I don't think that should be seen as some kind of obstacle to progress. No, you can't have progress that is remote or distanced from the wishes of people. If you ask me what is it that has prevented us from achieving our full potential, it is 3 decades of terror. 3 decades of terror. I mean, I know as a minister who handled various responsibilities for a long time, however hard you tried at that time, there was no way that you could have attracted investment into our country. Can you persuade tourists to come here? In those days, I had the visiting fellowship at All Souls, Oxford. So I would leave, say, Sri Lanka on a Thursday, I get to the UK, and over the weekend, the British papers are full of events that are supposed to have taken place here. Some were accurate, some were somewhat exaggerated. But all in all, there was no way in that environment that you could expect to persuade investors, tourists, and so on to come. And that went on, not just for a few years, it went on for a very long time. But now, happily, we are out of the woods. So if you are identifying some kind of inhibiting factor, it is certainly not politics, it is not elections, it is not the democratic process. It is a reign of terror which engulfed us for 30 years.
If I may, add on to that point from a Singapore perspective. Again, a lot of people inaccurately think, oh, if only we had a government like Singapore, is somehow strong central authority that doesn't need to deal with elections or people. It would be a misreading, because one of the things that kept the government on its toes was really universal franchise from 1965, from the time we became independent, which was never broken. There was never a period when elections were not held. Even India suspended elections for a period. For us, come what may, every once 4 or 5 years, there will be elections. And the need to go back to the electorate served as a serious reality check on delivery. You've got to deliver to the people. So, again, you go back, you look at the political systems, there have been autocratic systems, there have been dictatorships, there have been military dictatorships, there have been one-party rules. In the end, there's only been one criteria for success, and that's really the quality of the leadership. And you have been growing at a significant clip since 2009. The quality of the leadership meant that from 1960s, if you see, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, unbroken rule, the same people in power, but the quality of the leadership delivered progress at a faster clip than has been seen anywhere else. And now China is replicating that in a more massive way, in an unimaginable way, across 1.3 billion people. And on constitutions, I said this in Parliament a couple of years ago, when I look up, for those who believe that the constitutions alone deliver progress, the most beautiful constitutions in the world are those of North Korea, and they're all the rights and beautifully written, everything is there in North Korea. And Myanmar before the reform also had an excellent constitution. So that's a reality check for those who think that the best written constitutions deliver progress.
Thank you. The job of a moderator is fairly easy. I can now hand over to Sitara, and she will end up the PT. But before that, I want to thank the 2 eminent members of this panel who answered the questions very frankly and honestly. Something that Professor Pires said reminded me of my experience. He said he did Latin in first year. I did Latin in my school as a second language. And my teacher was of Sri Lankan origin, Mr. Ignatius. And he used to tell some of the students who found it very difficult with the declensions that you will learn Latin when the cows learn to fly. And because of that, we used to say, only Sri Lankan cows will fly. So on that note, I pass it back to Sitara.
Thank you, Honorable Ministers, Professor Ferris and Mr. K. Shanmugam for such an insightful sharing, and Ambassador Pillai for chairing the session.